Throughout the history of the United States presidency, up until this current administration, we have had presidents who were incompetent and yet very good people. We've had presidents who were competent and very good persons. And we have had presidents who were not the best people in the world, but they were incredibly competent and capable. Richard Nixon fell into this last category. No one would ever have confused Richard Nixon with being a nice guy. Nonetheless, he was one of the most intelligent men to have ever sat in the White House and was, in some ways, almost genius-like in his grasp of foreign policy. He grew up in a Quaker home in Yorba Linda, California. He was a descendant of the founder of Cornell University on his mother's side, and actually Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, and Apple CEO Bill Gates also are descendants of the Cornell family as well, interestingly enough. Nixon, for his part, went to get involved in politics in California and became a staunch conservative, a staunch anti-communist. He participated in the prosecution of Alger Hiss. He was well known for being a hawk against the communists. He was not the most photogenic man in the world. He had a very stiff, very awkward approach to his public persona that often did not serve him well. Yet one-on-one, he could be at times warm and almost even engaging toward people. And as you can tell by looking at the photographs that have popped up of him, whether eating with his wife, Pat, or having a handshake with the king to proclaim the war on drugs, and of course, who better than Elvis to be the front man for the war on drugs? Elvis, who was so hopped up on prescription pain meds, why not? Okay. And in fact, I think that there is a series out on Netflix, or a show out on Netflix called Elvis and Nixon right now, or Nixon and Elvis. And so we take a look at Richard Nixon's America. And there in the picture you see the final goodbye of Richard Nixon as he leaves the White House the day after having resigned the presidency, flashing his famous victory sign as he flies off on Marine One to the airport to go home to California. We'll look at the social issues of the late 60s and early 70s of La Causa and the Indians, and the honorable peace, bringing an end to the Vietnam War. And I put honorable in quotes. And then we'll see Nixon's finest achievement, détente. And then we'll see Nixon's darkest hour, Watergate. Among the minorities agitating for a greater say in the life of the United States were Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans, and what were called Chicanos, young men of Mexican descent. And they found their champion in a man by the name of Cesar Chavez, who founded the National Farm Workers Association to protect the laborers that pick the fruits and vegetables that go on the grocery shelves. And his organization was called La Causa. La Causa advocated for fair wages, true integration of industries, more educational opportunities for Chicanos, and a pride in the Mexican heritage. Now, that is not to say that they were anti-American. It is simply their heritage as Mexicans living in the United States. And so they engaged in a series of walkouts to protest discrimination, to protest corporal punishment in the schools, which always seemed to be leveled toward children minority more than white children. And you also had Indian agitation, as American Indian tribes, again, not having been completely wiped out, and not having been completely suppressed, now rise up again to protest the termination of their reservations and land seizures by the government, or protesting through fish-ins in the Pacific Northwest as their industry was so, and their economy was so heavily dependent upon salmon fishing in the Pacific Northwest. And you had also the American Indian movement, who staged the Second Battle of Wounded Knee in 1973. And actually, they got to accept the Academy Award for Marlon Brando. When he received his Academy Awards, Brando would not show up. Instead, he would send a representative from the American Indian movement to bring public attention to the cause of Indians and the still poverty conditions of the reservations. Now remember that Richard Nixon had run for the presidency in 1968 saying that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. He had to deliver on that. Now in order to deliver on that, he had to put together a number of people in his cabinet, and there were some rather interesting figures in this particular cabinet. Most notable of them was John Mitchell, his Attorney General. He was a close friend of the president's. He was a municipal bond lawyer. It is he that helped fashion Nixon's law and order campaigns toward anti-war protesters and toward minorities that were rising up in the inner cities. But Mitchell himself was an incredibly corrupt individual. H.R. Bob Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, known as the Hammer, one of the most feared men in the Nixon cabinet. And Dr. Henry Kissinger, who served as National Security Advisor and later as Secretary of State in both the Nixon and Ford administrations. Kissinger is one of the most controversial figures of the conservative wing and of foreign policy, and is widely regarded by some to be a war criminal who cannot leave this country. Well, that being put aside, Nixon now pushes for the Paris peace talks, in which Le Duc Tho of North Vietnam, Kissinger of the United States, and Nguyen Van Chu, the president of South Vietnam, now begin to work on a peace agreement. But Chu is, shall we say, rather unwilling. He is being pressured by Nixon to take part in this. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, with the war going on, Nixon announces that troops have got to start coming home because that's part of his promise. And so he calls it Vietnamization. And this is actually the title of the term that was created by his Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird. It would consist of the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. Instead of bringing all the U.S. troops home at once, instead they would gradually withdraw U.S. troops and then turn over the fighting to the South Vietnamese Army. There's one problem with that. The South Vietnamese Army is not yet ready to take over the fighting. They need more time, and time is something they simply do not have. Nixon also promotes what is called the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine states very specifically that we will help you with arms and weapons and money in the fight against communism, but you have to basically do it on your own. That's the Nixon Doctrine. Now, Nixon is trying to bring an end to the Vietnam War, but what happens is that during his administration, the war expands slightly into Cambodia. And when the war expands into Cambodia, this ignites renewed student protest, such as the infamous Kent State shooting, in which 4 students, unarmed, were gunned down by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Because of the tremendous backlash as a result of this incident, Nixon has to go on and he gives what is called his famous silent majority speech, in which Richard Nixon reaches out to you Americans who consist of the vast silent majority. That is, those who were not the protesters, those who were quiet but supported the American goals in Vietnam. It's a resounding success, and the protesters really take it on the chin as a result of this. And that is Dr. Henry Kissinger, who has long been considered a foreign policy guru and is often featured, or was often featured, on news programs. He is known for his very deep German baritone when he speaks like this on U.S. foreign policy. But Dr. Kissinger is, like I said, regarded by some as a war criminal, And it is considered unsafe for him to leave the country because then he might be scooped up and brought to The Hague and put on the war crimes tribunal over there. But he is one of the leading figures of American foreign policy in the 1960s and 70s. This is the iconic image of the shootings at Kent State. The incursion of U.S. forces into Cambodia ignited a protest at Kent State University. James Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, called out the National Guard to deal with the student protest. They were given live ammunition, and someone gave the order, and they fired into the crowd of protesters who were unarmed. 4 people died, 3 of whom did not even participate in the demonstration. One of them, Jeffrey Miller, you see lying on the ground dead, having taken a bullet through the mouth. And kneeling over him is Marianne Vecchio, a 14-year-old runaway from California who got caught up in the social tide of the peace movement and found herself in Ohio. John Philo of the Associated Press took this picture, which then was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for photography. After it was over with, the initial reaction among many was to blame the student protesters for the firing of the weapons. President Nixon called the dead students a bunch of bums, which prompted the father of one of the girls who was killed at Kent State to publicly make a statement and say, "Mr. President, my daughter is no bum. She was just trying to go to class." Ironically enough, there was another student nearby who was not taking part in the protest, but instead he was hurrying to take his job on as a graduate assistant with the Kent State football team. He had played football for Kent State and was a pretty good defensive back. His name was Nick Saban. Here you see the memorial erected by the Vietnamese government to the victims of My Lai. The crime itself was an atrocity. This was a crime against human nature, and it needed to be prosecuted. But as if that weren't bad enough, it was the cover-up. It was the failure for more than 18 months to let the American people know what had happened here. The men that perpetrated My Lai were lost in the fog of war. Now, this is not to excuse them in any way, but they had been on edge since the Tet Offensive. They had lost a great deal. They were tired, and they were poorly led by a person who should never have been in the Army in the first place. That being said, the Army's subsequent cover-up of My Lai turned Americans completely against their government at this point. What you see today, the round distrust of government by the American people did not always exist in this country. Many people trusted the government. They didn't trust it after this. In June of 2009, your humble professor had the opportunity to go to Vietnam, and on a day in which we were actually supposed to just simply engage in a little R&R from our long tour, which was kind of rigorous, we had the opportunity to go, or some of us had the opportunity to go to My Lai, and I chose to go and see there for myself that which had happened back then. It was a very, very emotional, moving moment in my life back in 2009. You see here is the wall plaque inside the little museum at My Lai, listing the names of all those women, children, elderly, who were indiscriminately slaughtered by William Calley and his troops. Had it not been for Hugh Thompson of Alexandria, Louisiana, the My Lai massacre would have probably been in the 1,000 range. Hugh Thompson landed his helicopter between Calley and the remaining victims and basically said that it was Calley that was going to have a hole through his head if he fired one more shot. And for this, there were several that said that Hugh Thompson was a traitor to the United States and should be tried for treason. I took this picture of this trench because this was the killing trench in which the soldiers lined the civilians along there and then proceeded to cut them down with rifle and machine gun fire, and their bodies would tumble into the ditch. The finest achievement of the Nixon administration was called détente. Détente was a reduction in the tensions with China and the Soviet Union that had actually begun after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it was Nixon that brought it to full fruition. Part of it was so that he could get the communist powers on his side to pressure the North Vietnamese to come to the negotiating table. But the other part of it was to remove the specter of nuclear war from being a distinct possibility, at least not make tensions get worse. That's the big thing. The first goal was China. And so what happened was that we decided to engage the Chinese in what was called ping-pong diplomacy, in which we would send members of our table tennis team over to play the Chinese in Beijing, and would get on ABC's Wide World of Sports. And it was the beginning of an inroads. Through the work of Henry Kissinger and intermediaries, Nixon made his famous trip to China in 1972, and there he met with Zhou Enlai, who made Nixon walk across the tarmac to him and standing still as sort of a getting back even with the U.S. for rebuffing him back at Geneva in the 1950s. And then he met with the communist emperor himself, Mao Zedong, who was now elderly and retired, but still the beloved leader of China at the time. Because of Nixon's inroads to China, he then was invited to come to Moscow, and there he met with Brezhnev and helped sign the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which tried to reduce the intercontinental ballistic missiles and the SBMs, okay, the submarine ballistic missiles. Nixon also reached out toward Latin America, continuing to isolate Cuba, that communist bastion in the Caribbean. And in doing this, he gave support for right-wing dictators like the Somoza regime. And Kissinger, in one of his, considered to be one of his war crimes, helped the CIA overthrow Salvador Allende in Chile, who had been elected but was considered to be too far left, too pro-communist for the Americans. And so they installed the dictator in Chile, whose name at the moment escapes me. Nixon's domestic agenda was somewhat progressive in some ways, very conservative in others. Again, reducing the Great Society by going after welfare reform. But Nixon also helped create the EPA and enhanced environmental regulation. Nixon's big domestic agenda, though, was to reach out and close the deal with many Southern Democrats who had been disillusioned with desegregation in the civil rights movement. This is called the Southern Strategy. It was basically telling Southern Democrats like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and Trent Lott and others, if you are disillusioned with the Democratic Party because of their commitment to civil rights, then come over to us. It was a very cynical move on the part of the Republicans. And it is an ongoing debate right now in social media about how the Democratic Party at one time was the party of the Ku Klux Klan, and that's undeniable. But the Democratic Party has shifted over time, and the Republican Party, with Nixon and others, reach out to disillusioned white conservative Democrats in the South and bring them into the party. And this is what finally seals the deal and flips the solid Democratic South to where it is now the solid Republican South. Once Nixon arrived in Beijing, China, and all the political posturing came to an end, the leaders could sit down and be comfortable with each other. And here you see Nixon meeting with Zhou Enlai in the upper left and basically letting him know how long a foot-long hot dog was in America. We're not sure what he's exactly saying there. But you can see that Nixon has a tremendous ease when he's talking one-on-one with somebody, which was not something that he had in larger crowds. Here you see Nixon shaking the hand of the elderly Mao Zedong, the great revolutionary of China, who was essentially the communist emperor of China. Here you see one of the iconic images of the great visit of Nixon to China as he and Mrs. Nixon stroll along the Great Wall. The Great Wall of China, of course, one of the biggest wastes of brick and mortar and human labor in all of history, but is a great tourist attraction. You have to understand something about the visit to China. And there's the joke from the Star Trek movies that we have a saying on Vulcan that only Nixon could go to China. But it is true. Only Nixon, the absolute anti-communist. Many of the communist world thought that Nixon was a madman when it came to the communist world, and yet it is he, not a Democratic president, but a Republican president, a staunch anti-communist, that is able to close the deal on opening up the People's Republic of China to diplomatic relations with the U.S. and essentially flipping the script with Taiwan and making it what's called the One China policy. Keep that in mind, the One China policy, that China and Taiwan are one nation, and the U.S. recognizes now for the last 50 years the government of the People's Republic of China, and we do not recognize the government of Taiwan anymore. Of course, here's Nixon having gone now to Russia, meeting with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, and Nixon apparently is ordering 2 vodkas at this point. No, we don't know what he's saying, but again, you see the ease with which Nixon is able to engage these world leaders, many of whom thought that he was crazy, insane, ready to go to war over a little thing. And instead, he turned out to be the Prince of Détente. The real tragedy of the whole thing with Nixon in China and the Soviet Union is that as he is meeting with them, his administration is starting to unravel. Once again, just like with My Lai, okay, there's the crime, which is bad. But crimes can be overcome if they're admitted to right away. What happened was the cover-up. It was the cover-up that does Richard Nixon in. Watergate revolved around the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters by operatives working for the committee to re-elect President Nixon. And it happened at the great condominium complex of Watergate, which is one of the ugliest buildings that you'll ever see. It's one of the first buildings that you see when you cross the Potomac. If you take your eyes away from the Capitol Dome and the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, you look to your left up the Potomac, and there's this big, ugly complex that is called Watergate. Well, what is Watergate about? Okay, in 1972, Richard Nixon is running for re-election, and he considers himself vulnerable. He has to get the deal done with Vietnam. The Democratic Party, however, is an absolute hot mess of a party at this point. And in their convention, after just countless ballots, they finally come down to George McGovern of South Dakota. But McGovern is not nominated until about 2:30 in the morning, and he has to give his speech while most Americans are sound asleep in bed. He said he gave the speech of his life. But McGovern comes to the nomination because the front runner in the race, Edmund Muskie, U.S. Senator from Nebraska, was essentially forced from the race after a series of dirty tricks by the Nixon campaign led Muskie to breaking down and crying on stage in front of the American people. And that was the end of Edmund Muskie. George Wallace, who was also running for president, once again on his American Independent Party, was shot in Maryland on May 15, 1972, and paralyzed from the waist down. He tried to keep the campaign going, but he could not carry it on. The Nixon campaign, led by John Mitchell, was called the Committee to Re-elect the President. The mnemonic is CREEP. Now, that's not a very good mnemonic to have. And it specialized in dirty tricks. And the prince of the dirty tricks was a California lawyer by the name of Donald Segretti. What we also found out along the way is that they were conducting surveillance. And this was part of the Watergate break-in. The break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters, located in the Watergate complex, was carried out by a group of men who worked for the CIA and for other organizations in the government called the Plumbers. And what they had done in order to break in to Watergate, they had to leave some tape on a lock in order to get back out again. And a security guard saw the tape and went up and arrested these men. It started out as a very small thing. And Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, reporters, young reporters, hungry reporters for the Washington Post, got their teeth into this story. And they begin to follow a trail that leads eventually to the President of the United States. And in order to do this story, they had to confirm much of their information. And so they had Woodward cultivated a source within the FBI whose name was Mark Felt, but they knew his name, but they never gave his name out. So nobody ever knew his name. He was given the code name Deep Throat, which was based on the first major pornographic movie to come out and become a sensation of the 1970s. As they begin to uncover more with the mantra, follow the money, following the money, they make it all the way into the White House itself, and this triggers the Watergate hearings, which is very much similar to the Russia-Ukraine hearings. Sam Ervin, a Democrat from North Carolina, an unreconstructed Democrat in his own mind, but a big-time supporter of the Constitution, chaired the Senate committee that started investigating and bringing witnesses. Imagine that, they brought witnesses this time. And it is John Dean, who is a special counsel to the president, that implicates the President of the United States in the cover-up itself. And while all this is going on, Spiro Agnew, the Vice President of the United States, has to resign as Vice President. And so, Richard Nixon now names Gerald R. Ford as Vice President of the United States, which was a fateful decision in so many ways. That is the Watergate complex. That's actually just one building of the Watergate complex, which is one of those modernistic looking buildings up the Potomac. And basically it goes with the Washington landscape the same way a turd goes in a punch bowl. But this is where it all went down. Why did Watergate happen in the first place? Is because Richard Nixon was incredibly afraid, and the Republican committee to re-elect the president was incredibly afraid that the Democratic National Committee had evidence that Richard Nixon had been farting around with the Vietnam peace talks back in the 1968 election. And this was a federal crime, just like with Michael Flynn, as I stated earlier. The break-in was to try and find that evidence. The plumbers had done a break-in earlier of Daniel Ellsberg's therapist's office. He had been seeing a psychiatrist, and they wanted to get a hold of his notes so that they could discredit Ellsberg rather than have people listen to him. This was the cover-up. This was the part that brings Nixon down. While Nixon did not authorize the break-in, he authorized the cover-up. And because of this, it was now getting closer. And as if that wasn't enough, it was now noted that Richard Nixon was taping White House conversations. And the Justice Department, under the guidance of Elliot Richardson, now appointed a special counsel, Archibald Cox, to look into the Watergate situation. And Cox was getting closer and closer to the president. And so Richard Nixon then ordered Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox. Richardson said, "No, Mr. President, I can't do that. I am not here to protect you. I'm here to protect the Constitution of the United States," and he resigned. Nixon then turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, and said, "Mr. Ruckelshaus, you will now fire Mr. Cox." Ruckelshaus said, "Mr. President, I am not going to do that. I'm here to protect the Constitution, not the President, not the person of Richard Nixon." Richard Nixon then fired William Ruckelshaus. The next person in line of authority was the Solicitor General of the United States, who is the lawyer who argues cases for the president before the Supreme Court. This was Robert Bork. Bork then fires Archibald Cox. This is called the Saturday Night Massacre, in which one resignation and two firings take place. But while Archibald Cox was fired, the investigation was not halted in the least. In the meantime, indictments begin to flow out because of Watergate. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, now the campaign manager for the committee to re-elect the president, is indicted. He'll go to jail. Bob Haldeman is indicted. He will go to jail. John Ehrlichman, who basically got up and tried to strong-arm the Senate of the United States to say, "You shall not question the president." And Sam Ervin said, "Oh, I shall. I've got the Constitution here to prove it." This was back when people actually were devoted to the Constitution rather than to individuals. Nixon is named also as an unindicted co-conspirator. As a result of this, the House now goes to work with an impeachment committee led by a lawyer by the name of John Doerr, and they, in the end, passed 3 articles of impeachment, contempt of Congress, and the cover-up and the crime, and so forth. Nixon makes his decision on August the 9th, 1974, to resign the presidency. The day before, Nixon addresses the nation and says that I will resign the presidency effective at 12 noon tomorrow. And so at 12 noon on August the 9th, 1974, Gerald Ford became the 38th president of the United States. Gerald Ford, who had served on the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford, who had been a congressman in Michigan, who is now risen to the level of vice president because Spiro Agnew, the vice president, was indicted and sent to prison as well. These are the chief players in Watergate. At the top, from left to right, John Mitchell, the Attorney General. Center top, Bob Haldeman. Right top, John Ehrlichman. Bottom left, former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy, who has lost all the hair on the top of his head, is a frequent contributor on the Fox Entertainment Channel. In the center is John Dean, who's a frequent contributor on MSNBC. He's now gone totally white, but is a frequent guest whenever they talk about possible impeachments of presidents and issues that go on in the presidency. He served several years in jail and then got out. And in the lower right is Deep Throat himself, Mark Felt, an FBI agent who had upfront news and confirmed everything that was going on to the Washington Post. Felt died in the early 2000s. And here are the two reporters of the Washington Post that broke the story. On the left, Carl Bernstein, and on the right, Bob Woodward, who are frequent contributors on CNN and other news networks about journalism and uncovering government corruption. At the time of Watergate, they were just young city beat reporters that were looking for a big story. And boy, did they ever find it. They would write a book together called All the President's Men that would be made into a movie, which I highly recommend you watch for extra credit. The Nixon years were not completely bad. I've already mentioned détente, but perhaps the finest moment in U.S. history of the 20th century is the three men who went to the moon, and two of them walked on the moon. In the picture to the left, lower left, is Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon. The lower right of the picture is Edwin Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man on the moon, and in the piloting the command module in orbit around the moon was Michael Collins. And of course, I'm sure you all have seen the picture of Buzz Aldrin beating the crap out of some moon landing denier about a year or so ago. Buzz is still going strong and is in many commercials. This is a picture that Armstrong took of Aldrin as he is walking on the moon. A great moment in U.S. history.